Well, she decided that, you know, I'll only rent out 3 units at a time, but I'm going to have 5 available, so there's choices. So she created themed bed and breakfast rooms. That immediately triggered a deluge of bureaucratic harassment like you cannot imagine. She received, over 6 months, 5 citations. If you saw these things, I mean, they're absurd. The carbon copy's going to about 6 to 12 different bureaucrats every time she's getting one of these things. She was dragged into 4 public hearings to justify advertising more than seldom, to justify why she kept 2 of her units empty instead of having only 3 and only 3 occupied. They were trying to force her through another regulatory route that was almost equivalent to what you would have to require of, say, a Hilton or a Best Western, with food regulations requiring all sorts of engineering plans and so on, which would have made no sense for her or what she was operating. So here you had advertising more than seldom triggering a deluge of bureaucratic flack. You have a creative response to a limitation generating interest from almost a dozen bureaucrats trying to shut her down. What happened to Kayla? She too had her right to a presumption of liberty and her property rights violated. But I think her fix is different. 19 states have what's called sunrise review for regulations in regulatory agencies. 26 states have sunset review for agencies and regulations. Again, for some reason, these concepts are never applied to local government. We're all enamored of local control. Nothing bad can ever happen at the local level, right? What sunrise review is it is based on this proposition. No regulation of a peaceful activity may be had, no regulatory agency may be created by law unless the proponent proves it's legitimate. Now there's multiple factors involved in that, but that's the basic proposition. In the states that have that process, it does help block new regulations and regulatory agencies from ever being proposed. If the proponent knows they have to do more than glad hand a bunch of people their lobbyists know, if they actually have to present a report demonstrating its legitimacy. And you can call legitimacy anything you want, but just having someone articulate a basis for a regulation with a straight face before a group of legislators is often enough deterrence to stop the bad regulations. I think this would stop regulating bed and breakfast. Why in the world are 12 bureaucrats focused on devoting all of these resources to shutting down a bed and breakfast? It makes 0 sense. Let's have the proponent of that justify it under any set of factors. Now, sunset review is sunrise review at the tail end. 26 states say after a certain period of time, your law goes away unless the proponent of it justifies keeping it alive. Let's apply these concepts to local government. That would have saved Kayla and Frank Pearson, I think, 9 times out of 10. Because good people elected to government are not going to let bed and breakfasts be harassed like that. And they're certainly never going to let a standard of, we're not going to allow more than seldom advertising to get past them. Let me introduce you to Mike Goodman. Now, Mike Goodman's in a different place than the other 2 folks that we've talked about. He's actually quite wealthy. Very successful developer in Tucson. Knowledgeable, can work the system, understands risks. He has no immunity. Local government turns on him regularly. Changes the rule of the game in the middle of the game all the time. If he didn't have the resources to fight back, he'd be out of business. What happened to Mike in Tucson is almost, well, it is absurd. He bought land from the city of Tucson within a half a mile of the University of Arizona. He told the city, when he bought the land, I'm putting student dormitories here. He told the city, I'm not going to put up a giant house, and just pile it in with multi-unit apartments. I'm going to build separate duplexes. I'm going to make them luxury dormitories. He laid the whole thing out. The city said, great, you can buy it. He bought it. They approved his building permits and his plans. He started building, put in the foundation work, put up the framing. Well, the neighborhood in Tucson's a funny group. The neighborhoods out there don't like student dormitory housing around universities. They think they've got enough of that. They'd rather the students live in the suburbs and commute. So after he had already begun his work, had all of his building permits, a neighborhood group, a NIMBY group, got together and harassed the zoning administrator of Tucson until he was pressured politically into deciding that he was going to demand of Mike a new set of plans because he wanted to double check the water retention systems were done right. And even though they knew exactly what he was doing for years, he laid it all out, it was all understood. So Mike made the mistake of saying, you know, I'll just jump that hoop, I'll give him what he wants. So he gave him back the plans that they'd already approved with a couple of tweaks on it to reflect some minor changes that they had approved in the process of development. And the zoning administrator, aha, you've created a unitary development. You see, all of these units that you're creating are not really separate units. You plan to build them all eventually in one unitary plan. And that requires you, Mike, to go through an entirely different process. And Mike said, I'm not going to go through that process. So he revoked his building permits. And so Mike said, all right, well, I'll take you to court on that. Well, he said, well, then I'm not going to let you cover your exposed foundations and framing work from the elements. So for the next 2 years, while Mike battled in the first in the Board of Adjustment, which is at the local level, then he battled and lost there. Then he battled to the Superior Court, lost there, and he battled to the Court of Appeals and won. And the Court of Appeals said, you're right. You had a right to build your dormitories. Your building permit was wrongly revoked. But the problem was he had already spent $100,000 in attorney's fees. His framing work was destroyed by the elements. What utilities he put in was vandalized. He sustained easily another couple $100,000 in damages because he basically had to now demolish all the work he did. Now, he can handle that loss, but you can see how anyone of less than extraordinary means would neither have the fortitude to fight this or the ability to deal with the consequences of winning. So understand that there are men like Mike Goodman out there that will fight, but they even, in the end, lose. And I can guarantee you this, he's not going to be looking for any more opportunities to win like he won. And they effectively chased him out of that line of work in Tucson. Well, what would have helped out? What would have worked? What would have been the reform for Mike? Well, let's ask, what was violated? Well, of course, he did lose the presumption of liberty. He wasn't able to continue peaceably acting with respect to his own property. But I'd say that property rights was more an issue here. I mean, he had what, by any common sense understanding, was a clearly vested right to develop this property. I mean, how much more vested could it be? I mean, the city understood what he was doing. They gave him permits to do what he was doing. He was doing what he was doing. I mean, you can't, at this point, debate whether he has a real connection as a human being to the uses of his property. He does. He's clearly got a property right that is ripened. And he's also got a loss of accountability. What is the zoning administrator going to suffer for what he did to Mike? He's not an elected official. Civil service employee, protected by multiple layers of bureaucracy from ever being fired for misjudgment in the ordinary course of his duties. Mike's got no accountability for what losses he sustained. Yeah, he might collect attorney's fees from the city in a constitutional lawsuit that he's since filed 5 years from now. Might get some damages. But the zoning administrator's not going to suffer. There's no skin off his nose, and he's probably doing what he did to Mike right now. What would have fixed the situation? 3 basic things. Believe it or not, you don't own your property when you buy it. Not in any real meaningful sense. The uses that you can lawfully have with your property in every state just about are not protected constitutionally until you start using them physically, you know, putting something into the ground. So just because you bought a piece of property that's zoned commercial If you haven't done anything,